So I'm really pleased to introduce our keynotes, Dr. Anjali Dalal-Clayton and Ananda Rutherford. So they're going to be drawing on their research as part of the AHRC-funded Provisional Semantics project, and they'll be advocating for a slow approach to cataloguing. After their keynote presentation, they're going to be joined in conversation with Dr. Janice Cheddi, Kelly Foster, and Kathleen Turner, who is appearing with two hats on today, this morning, and also this afternoon. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Anjali and Ananda. Thank you both.
Can you hear me or see me? Okay.
Yes, we can.
Great. Sorry, Sarah. I'm set up in a way I can't quite see what's going on. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Anjali and I are really glad to be here and speaking to you today, but sad, as others have said, not to be up in Sheffield hanging out with you all. And yeah, the point about lunch has really got my tummy rumbling already, but I'll try and push through. Many, many thanks to Sarah and the Collections Trust for asking us to speak at all today and for being very open to our slightly different ways of working. And of course, for all the hard work that has gone into pivoting from real to virtual space in just a very few days. So to start, Anjali and I have been working together for the last few years on the topics of cataloguing and interpretation, and we're going to reflect today on the work we did on the Provisional Semantics Research Project, which ran between 2020 and 2022. Working on this project helped develop our thinking about GLAM knowledge practices, and we're framing today's talk in terms of a slow cataloguing approach, advocating for time, space and resources for this crucial but still undervalued work. Museum cataloguing, or the ongoing process of recording and managing information about collections as currently defined in the new Spectrum guidance, has of late come into focus for challenge and discussion as never before. How and what we catalogue is under scrutiny and has been found wanting, particularly through the lens of what might be referred to as the decolonial turn and the increasing recognition that museums are not objective or neutral. Furthermore, in light of large-scale collections digitisation, the extent of these issues and museums' contributions to the cultural digital record has been exponentially amplified. Within the sector, anyone dealing with any level of collections information has known this for years. Information about our collections can be outdated, inaccurate, or just missing, however hard we attempt to address this Sisyphean task. Increasingly, with fewer staff, fewer resources, and little institutional support. Endeavours to address the issues are long overdue and now welcome, hence our gathering here today to rethink cataloguing. And the idea of this slide, just to justify myself, is what documentation actually feels like, the data rain in which we're meant to be making everything binary, and then the magic of Tom Cruise having all information everywhere easily at his fingertips. And I hope that was obvious, but there we go. So, and at the same time, over the last 20 years, there's been a significant and persistent push across the museum sector to digitise collections, images and information at scale, ostensibly to improve and democratise online access through new technologies. The driving motivation seems to have been that more is always better, but arguably more is just more, and often just more of the same. Mine and Anjali's own work admittedly has been and currently is funded as part of this endeavour through the AHRC Towards a National Collection, or TANC as we usually call it, initiative, which claims that by seizing the opportunity presented by new digital technology, it will allow researchers to formulate radically new research questions, increase visitor numbers, dramatically expand and diversify virtual access to our heritage, and bring clear economic, social and health benefits to communities across the UK. Which is a hell of a claim. This valorisation of the use of collections information and the power of digital technologies to solve what are essentially complex socio-political problems is not uncommon in our sector. However, the pace, scope and resourcing of digital dissemination, which has effectively dominated our documentation and collections management work for nearly 3 decades, and certainly all of my career, has arguably not actually fostered and maybe fundamentally incompatible with the in-depth, ethical and equitable knowledge production required for a genuinely meaningful contribution to the cultural and digital record that collections cataloguing could and should underpin and support. What happens when we catalogue an object, artwork or artifact? When we record what is known and known by whom, and then present it to the online world? When we capture object information in our collections databases, we effectively codify and fix that information within a prescribed organisation system, and often without context, history or authorship. When it is then remediated online for widespread dissemination, the effect of codification can be repeated and repurposed almost infinitely, and the dislocation from source and context increases. While this undeniably allows for faster search and more predictable retrieval, replication across multiple platforms, use in data visualization or machine learning, we quickly lose sight of the fact that these data are not neutral or binary or even accurate, and were created and exist within very particular, problematic and dominant social and cultural hierarchies of Western European thought. These are by now well-rehearsed arguments, but when we draw a line connecting collections cataloguing to digital technologies, to online dissemination, to democratization and cultural diversity, we see that the promise of the digital is, for cultural heritage, predicated on the assumption that the catalogue records are an accurate, rich and firm foundation. But are they? For me, at this moment, museum collections cataloguing, content and practice suffers from the following, and I've got a bit of a list here. A persistent belief in both the objectivity and neutrality and the authority of what we put out there. A belief that the organisation of data is more useful than the mess of it. A propensity for cleaning up, standardising and erasing. An embarrassing tendency to solicit engagement when nothing is recorded or known about an item within the institution. A habit of not recognising or including or recording expertise through lived experience. A tendency not to question expertise in the traditional sense, and a legacy of not including difficult issues, objects and histories within the record. Further, all this is compounded by a lack of investment, a lack of recognition of the need for cataloguing to be properly funded, a lack of development of digital tools to deal with contestation, nuance and debate, a lack of recognition of where the work is being done outside the traditionally recognised arenas of museums and academia. This means we are still basing new technologies for engagement, dissemination and inclusion on what are essentially the incunabula of collections information. So what to do? As practitioners and researchers, and for our audiences, we need cataloguing practices where depth, focus, context and ethical engagement are valued over expediency, speed and scale, and are embedded as core purpose within organisations rather than as project-based interventions. This approach is especially critical in museum collections that contain work by minoritised and racialised makers, where a lack of knowledge, interest and care is often evident within the record and cements their long-standing neglect and marginalisation by public cultural institutions. Two recent articles using the principles of the slow movement resonated strongly with me and encapsulated many of the things we had observed as valuable in the response and cataloguing work we carried out in the provisional semantics case studies. Anjali will expand on the specifics of the project and this work in a moment, but I would like to speak a little longer on slow in the context of museum collection cataloguing. Slow doesn't necessarily mean slow. The slow movement is probably best known in terms of food as a rejection of fast food and industrial scale food production, and espouses, and I think this is from the Slow Food website for the UK, a commitment to community and the environment, taking time to appreciate and understand sources and impact. But how does this relate to museum cataloguing? In his recent chapter, Is Less More? Slow Data and Datification in Archaeology, in the publication Critical Archaeology in the Digital Age, Jeremy Huggett of Glasgow University usefully examined slow in relation to archaeological data and the idea of slow data as a counterpoint to ideas of big data. While UK cultural heritage data may not quite meet the designation of truly big data, the persistent push to datification and digitisation of collections and collections information shares many commonalities with the attitudes and behaviours around big data. For Huggett, slow is about adopting an appropriate speed suitable to the situation. It entails resistance across the range of dominant neoliberal rhythms and values and critiques our practices and ethics. These slow values seemed crucial to me in how cataloguing work is approached. Additionally, working out where information and data comes from, who created it and why, and understanding its life cycle and impact is just as important in cataloguing as it is in food production. It's great to see these aspects of cataloguing practice articulated clearly now in the new Spectrum Cataloguing Guidance, which sets out some of these crucial ethical questions. The second article I want to refer to about SLO is about SLO as an approach to archival cataloguing, which is has a particularly nuanced and sensitive approach, is Kimberly Kristen and Jane Anderson's 2019 article in Archival Science, Towards a Slow Archive. They ask, how do we recognise and rebuild archival practices, structures and procedures and workflows that allow for relational, reciprocal, respectful and restorative connections to knowledge, kin and community within their own frame? Their answer, again, is a slow approach. They describe how slowing down, and by extension, valuing slowing down, can create a space in which we can consider how knowledge production works in our organisations, how it is presented and contextualised and used. They emphasise listening, changing focus and acting ethically. And these approaches, they argue, allow for the complex networks of relationships that connect people and things to surface, rather than always reverting to the usual structures of ownership and attribution. For me, this is exactly what the practice of a rethought cataloguing practice should look like: considered, reflective and careful. It may seem that this is only applicable to community archives and perhaps ethnographic collections, but if we put those constricting collection classifications aside, the values of the slow archive and approach to slow data, grounded in a broad understanding of cultural sovereignty, we can apply these principles to all our collections, sorry. I'm going to hand over to Anjali now to expand the work we try to do within the provisional semantics project and how it might be understood in relation to the principles of slow data and slow cataloguing and some of the barriers and issues we faced.
Okay, thanks, Ananda. So I'm going to briefly outline our methodology for provisional semantics and then delve into the 3 case studies that comprise the research, noting in each some of our key findings and experiences. So, provisional semantics was one of 8 projects in the first part of the TANK programme, which were known as foundation projects. Our aim was to address a fundamental challenge facing the TANK programme, which is how to develop ethical, equitable and transparent readings of the objects in a digitised national collection. At the start of the project, we devoted time afforded to us thanks to the disruption of the first months of the pandemic to reflect on our individual and collective positionalities in relation to the issues at stake within the project. Then we embarked on an approach that's probably best described as action research. For us, this meant meeting as a wider project team every month to engage with contextual reading material, to reflect on what we were doing and how we were doing it, and to adjust the research programme and expected outputs in line with our commitment to working in a genuinely collaborative and ethical way. During the course of the project, we weren't consciously thinking about this approach in relation to the principles of slow that Ananda has just set out. However, as I describe our research activities for you in a moment, some of the benefits and challenges of engaging in a slow approach to interpretation and cataloguing will hopefully become apparent. Provisional semantics comprised 3 case studies carried out with 3 partner institutions. These were Imperial War Museums, the National Trust, and Tate. All 3 case studies involved close reading collection objects and their associated information, interpretation, and presentation by the institutions. So let's now look at the first of the 3 case studies, which focused on a sample of 53 black and white photographs and their original captions from a series of British official photographs taken in India in 1942, and which are now part of the IWM's photography collection. The photographs depict the recruitment of Indian soldiers during the Second World War and were held by the Ministry of Information before entering the IWM collection. However, we don't know for sure who took them and why. These photographs were selected for the case study because of the colonial gaze that's present in the images, as well as the archaic and sometimes offensive language of the historic captions. Our aim then was to investigate whether we could mitigate these problematic framings by creating new contextual information and descriptions based on references and approaches not typically employed within the IWM. We initially considered community engagement activity with Indian veteran groups and their descendants as a way to evaluate current interpretation and as a way to co-produce new interpretation that would be informed by lived experience, inherited or generational knowledge, and personal response. But because the IWM knew so little about the histories and contexts of these photographs, we determined that we couldn't adequately support participants. And by that, I mean we couldn't undertake sensitive, well-informed, in-person activity under pandemic restrictions, nor maintain meaningful, long-term and mutually beneficial relationships with them, which for us were essential facets of ethical co-production. So we decided that our priorities for the case study were to address the missing histories and contexts of the images, to develop a more in-depth, critical and nuanced understanding of them, and to do this through collaboration with people who have both subject-specific expertise and, crucially, lived, bodied or inherited knowledge of the cultural context represented in the images, which had been absent from existing readings and presentations of the photographs at that time. So we began working with doctors Ashik Iqbal, Dia Gupta and Guy Bowman, who are subject specialists with expertise in Indian experiences of the Second World War. We ran online exhibitions with them to look at the photographs together closely, describing what we could see and recognize, what they thought was being depicted and why, what context the images were being taken in, and what we individually and collectively felt uncomfortable about when looking at them. Having done that, their brief was to research and respond to the images and their associated captions and labels, and then to critically describe and contextualize the photographs in a range of different texts that would be published online, alongside the historic captions, and these are now all available on the IWM web pages. However, any level of co-production is inevitably complex, and I'll now highlight some of the issues that arose. The first was in finding specialists not simply with the appropriate disciplinary expertise, but also with the skills and experience to interpret and contextualize sensitive and sometimes offensive objects. To be specific, we needed them to be able to shed light on and offer appropriate detail on the historical context for the photographs, and at the same time, to look beyond them as archival evidence and to consider them as material objects with the power to invoke deep discomfort. Not all of our collaborators were equipped to do this from the outset, and we had to adapt the research program and expected outcomes in order to allow time and space to engage with the photographs in a sensitive and multifaceted way. The second and perhaps most crucial challenge we encountered in the IWM case study was that of avoiding the unwitting reproduction of colonial tropes in new interpretation material. We found that inaccuracies in how images are described may only be obvious to the people they describe and their descendants, or to people who live in the nations they characterize. Working with the specialists, and particularly the two Indian scholars, we learned that colonial and imperial concepts and views often reside in seemingly innocuous phrasing and descriptions, appearing as benign in a traditionally white British setting. And this can make some colonial tropes difficult to identify and easy to reproduce, especially for those of us living and working in British contexts. So now I'm going to talk about the second of the three case studies in the project, which centered on the Clive Museum at Powys Castle and is looked after by the National Trust. The Trust claims that the castle holds one of the most important collections of Indian material culture outside of India, with more than 1,000 objects, including weaponry, textiles, and other decorative objects. And these objects were accumulated by the Clive family between 1744 and 1839 through a variety of methods, some violent, some coercive at best, though often described benignly as gifts. These objects have been on display at the castle since 1987, for which a set of highly stylized Orientalist cabinets and handwritten labels were designed to give the impression of a romantic 19th century collector's cabinet. These labels and other wall texts either provide scant information, present romanticized perspectives about the foundation of the British Empire and British conduct in India, or are highly inaccurate. And these captions haven't been updated for decades. So our initial objective with this case study was to develop factually and culturally sensitive interpretations for selected objects in the collection, involving ethical co-production with stakeholder communities, potentially involving a partnership with National Museum New Delhi and consultation with South Asian communities in Wales. However, as with the IWM case study, we determined that this case study first needed to address the absence of detailed provenance information on the collection, as well as the absence of relevant subject specialist knowledge amongst the National Trust curatorial and interpretation teams. We therefore pivoted away from producing new interpretation towards critically examining existing interpretation and testing close reading as a method for building knowledge of object collections. In our approach to close reading, we focused on individual objects, particularly in terms of the histories and contexts of their production, use, and cultural significance. After exploring a range of potential objects to focus on, we selected an 18th century book of poems by the 14th century Persian poet known as Hafez. It's an object of cultural, philosophical, and religious significance, but was displayed with minimal interpretive information in the corner of a small cabinet displaying the personal effects and trinkets once owned by Lady Henrietta Clive. So, we devised 3 collective online workshops, so collaborative online workshops, with 3 groups we felt had important knowledge to share about this book, its display and its reception by National Trust visitors. And the 3 workshops produced markedly different conversations. The first group was a group of external subject specialists who shared relatively well-established factual information about the book and explored how to understand its history and historiography, its significance across different cultures and over different time periods. This revealed both the National Trust's and our gross ignorance of the book and its culture of origin. The second group was made up of curatorial and interpretation staff from across the National Trust, including Christo Kefalas, who is speaking later today. They analysed how the language used in the display, interpretation, and cataloguing of the collection affected understanding of the Hafez poetry book in particular. And they also suggested practical solutions for updating cataloguing practices within the National Trust. The third group comprised non-curatorial site staff and volunteers who revealed in their discussions how knowledge and oft-repeated family or staff anecdotes are communicated on site and are presented as fact to visitors. Interestingly, while some of the participants expressed a desire to see up-to-date and factual interpretations of the collection within the museum, others shared more traditionally normative perspectives, were occasionally averse to presenting histories that might be thought of as decolonial, and were defensive of existing but problematic interpretations. Like the IWM case study, the National Trust case study surfaced the necessity of working with subject specialists, not least when in-house expertise relating to collection objects is lacking. Obviously, gaps in knowledge risk the perpetuation of problematic, offensive, and colonial perspectives and interpretations in collection records and object labels. But it also demonstrated the value of collaborative close reading as one of the essential methods for building knowledge around object collections and for revealing how they're differently understood. I'm now going to talk about the third and final case study from the project, which focused on the Panchayat collection. Dr. Janice Cheddi, who is one of the custodians of the collection, is joining us today. The collection was founded in 1988 by Bhajan Hunjan, Shaheen Murali, Simrat Bhatti, Alan D'Souza, and Shanti Thomas to promote the work of South Asian artists and artists with Black, Caribbean, and African heritage in the United Kingdom and internationally. It contains documents, ephemera, manuscripts, images, publications, and research material illustrating the important connections between modern art and activism. It's been held by the Tate Library since 2015, but was neither fully catalogued nor digitised when the project started, remaining underused and inaccessible for research and audiences until last year. Additionally, Tate had not successfully maintained an equitable relationship with the custodians of the collection, Shaheen Murali and Janice Cheddi. This was then complicated by the instigation of the Provisional Semantics Research Project and meant that working relationships were in need of repair and reparation. So our overarching objective for this case study was to produce contextual information for the Panchayat collection through collaborating with and drawing on knowledge held by its founders, custodians, and associated artists. To achieve this, there were three strands of activity. In the first strand, Murali and Cheddi each devised a range of resources to provide context for the formation of the collection and to highlight the practices of some of the artists represented in it. In the second strand, we commissioned two independent researchers, Marlene Smith and Dr. Alice Correa, to individually explore the use and history of the term Black, with specific focus on the way it was mobilized during the period the Panchayat collection was developing. And finally, in the third strand, two Tate Library team members oversaw cataloguing of the collection and the digitization of over 100 images selected by Cheddi and Murali. Our aim in all of this was to centre the knowledge and experience of the artists of the Panchayat to inform the Tate's archive and collection narratives. We wanted to do this collaboratively and to foreground their voices. However, in carrying out the case study, we encountered two major issues. One related to the ethical and practical dimensions of the research project structure. Several of the stakeholders we were collaborating with observed that, while their careers had been the focus of periodic, curatorial, and research interest in the past, these moments hadn't produced a lasting legacy and had remained peripheral within the dominant art historical narratives put forward by the institution. Some of the stakeholders were therefore sceptical as to whether their involvement in this project and with Tate would be worthwhile or beneficial to them. In this context of historical marginalization, not only of the collection, but also of the individuals represented in it, we needed to exercise reparative sensitivity. To do this well, we needed time and space to build trusting relationships with our stakeholders, but found that the restrictions of the project made this difficult, if not impossible. We concluded, perhaps obviously now, that relationship building is not well served by the project format and needs to be treated as ongoing core institutional work. The second issue we encountered related to our own limited understanding of the complexity of attempting to co-produce and incorporate a genuinely multi-perspectival and open approach, and how current institutional collections practices can actually preclude this. Activities that were essential to our research, such as recording personal accounts, documenting artistic practices, determining contractual obligations, negotiating intellectual property rights, and agreeing on use, were often structurally imbalanced in favour of Tate rather than the collaborating individuals. Excuse me. So this meant that our research practice, despite being positioned as a step towards addressing racial bias and exclusion, was actually extractive and exploitative due to the research taking place within an institutional context and our own ingrained institutionalized ways of working. I've probably said too much now about the project, and so now I'm going to hand back to Ananda to share some closing words.
Hi, thanks, Anjali. So to conclude, and going back to where I started really, digital dissemination and technological developments based on GLAM collections information and catalogue records undoubtedly have benefits in terms of widening access to cultural heritage, though widening for whom is a key issue. However, we need to consider carefully if we as a sector and as practitioners have contributed enough that is genuinely meaningful, equitable and representative, either to the cultural record or to people's engagement with public collections. What can we potentially achieve with a slower approach? If we pause for a moment to take the focus off mass aggregation or artificial intelligence or virtual reality or the short-term cleaning of the bad words, and look to carefully, slowly catalogue our collections with the people that matter, supporting existing communities and developing new communities of interest, what happens then? This is, of course, the work that many people are trying to achieve across the world, but it still remains largely peripheral to core practice in the UK. And when the big money is directed at research results and technological R&D, we cannot help but ask, to what end? The Provisional Semantics project simultaneously allowed us the time and space to test out slow approaches that are not always employed in either core or project work. But the project's own time, budget and scope constraints also place limitations on the potential of ethically engaged collaboration. If we are actually permitted to radically rethink how cataloguing is done and treated within the work of cultural and heritage institutions, we need to move beyond the filling in of data fields and data hierarchies and embrace the wealth of messy, human-centered knowledge. Thank you.